Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So thanks. I'm Uri, like was being said here, I'm the founder of the Guild. The Guild is a group that you will probably do more than you heard that we're doing, because we never publicize or talk about ourselves. We're basically a group of individual open source developers, but all of our open source libraries are being done under the person's name. So it's kind of like a distributed group of people. And a lot of the libraries that you see here, like all of the libraries that you see here, we wrote or actively maintain, and we have much more. Just to mention a bit, so a lot of them are around GraphQL, but not only. We have a bunch in Angular, we have a bunch in other frameworks that I won't mention the name here. Each one of those libraries is under a person's name because we believe actually a more sustainable open source model is not under a company. Like when you see a big library and it's under a company, people feel it's safer, but from my personal experience working with a lot of the biggest open source companies in the world, it's actually the opposite. Yeah, I won't go through all the libraries today, but maybe I'll mention a bit every once in a while when I'll talk about in my talk. What we do actually, how do we sustain all those libraries and how do we make it work and make it sustainable is that we work with clients, with very large corporations usually, just helping them modernize their stack. We have actually also clients here in Copenhagen, Nordea Bank, for example, you've probably heard about it. And all over the world we have companies like that. But with startups, we usually just help for free. So I will offer free PRs during my talk, and it's real offers. If you're a startup and you're thinking about using GraphQL, you're thinking about doing a re-architecture for whatever reason, you can talk to me and we can help you for free, just because we believe in the tools, we believe in the technology. There's nothing here that we sell. Everything is free and open source. I didn't expect that, thank you. I think it's the first time someone clapped for this. So today, so I have a bunch of talks, probably some of you already heard about some of my talks about GraphQL. I'm trying not to repeat myself. So what I thought I will do in this talk is, first of all, is look at why I think, everyone here, when I was walking in the conference, everyone was asking me, why in the Angular community GraphQL adoption hasn't been that big as other communities. And first of all, I think it's wrong. A lot of the biggest companies, the biggest Angular using companies are actually using GraphQL, you just don't hear about it. It's just somehow in conferences, usually I'm the only one talks about GraphQL. But actually on the ground, a lot of very large companies are using GraphQL. But there's still this misconception. And so what I wanted to do in this talk is basically show you where we use GraphQL, why do we use it for, and I think it's usually very different from what you usually hear about GraphQL. But maybe before that, who is here using GraphQL? Oh, quite some people. Who is ready to say why?
Freedom.
You.
Quickly implementation and type safety across the backend and the frontend, and code compilation that will work if the backend changes.
Okay, so tight integration with the backend, type safety between the backend and the frontend, and speed, development speed. Do any of the people here that use GraphQL would go back? Okay, that's good. Okay, so if everyone here that uses GraphQL never go back, so that's usually a good measure of why you should use something new. But I think, like what you said, that there's like a good tie between the backend and the frontend. People assume GraphQL is one thing that I'll mention now. Like it's basically, everyone tells us it's a query language over the network. So the client can ask for something and get it back in predictable result over the network. Let's see how it's usually presented to us. So we have a GraphQL server, and I'll rename that server later, but let's call it a GraphQL server. And what we basically do, we describe a schema of the data that the server exposes, and then the client basically can create a query for just what they need, in this case, a particular user and its name. And then that magical server will go fetch, first of all, the user, and then the name of the user, and then send back the client exactly, a response exactly like it was expected to get. So that's cool. But then if the client, let's say, now wants a message and all the messages of the user and the content, then this magical server will again run, execute, bring me the user, bring me the name and the messages of the user in parallel. And then also for each message, bring me the content of the message, and maybe the content comes from a third-party API like a CDN or whatever. But for the client doesn't care. The client doesn't know. The client just gets exactly the data that it needs, no more or no less, and in exactly the shape and the type that it was expected to get. So like you said, it's great. It solves a lot of like complexity over the network. And usually the main benefits that people are talking about when they talk about GraphQL is like exactly what I said. It's better performance, like less data over the network and less requests over the network. And that's true. Like, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. This is not true. This is actually true, and it saves a lot. And for companies like Facebook, it was a game changer. Like, that helped them build basically the most successful mobile app in the world. But when we come to companies, we see that this is nice, but they don't really care about that. Like, and it's weird because in conferences, everyone talks about like how to minimize the bundle size to the minimum possible. Not a lot of people are talking about the data and the network. But in most companies, that's not the main problem. The last thing you said is the most important problem is the development speed. In teams, usually what really bothers us from achieving the best performance possible is we don't have time. We have features to deliver. If we're larger companies, it's going to get it's getting complex. We move even slower. If it's small companies, we need to do a lot and to write a lot of code. And I think that GraphQL for us, and when we come to companies, we don't sell the performance benefits anymore. We talk about something else. We talk about the speed and the organization and the automation of development that GraphQL gives us. So I'm going to talk about that. So what is GraphQL? You know, we saw all this cool, amazing server. GraphQL is just a function. It's one function that you can use with JavaScript. It's a function that takes a schema, takes a query, and returns back the result. You can use that function over the network. You can use it inside your Angular apps locally. You can use it in your backend apps locally. You can use that function anywhere. And the main thing that that function does basically is, in my opinion, automation of execution. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So when we write the schema, we basically describe each field on the schema, let's say the user's name, is a function. We just described a function, so we can basically, and you do that today anyway. Like if you write a TypeScript class, and the class is a function, the function enters data and gets back data, that's basically GraphQL backend. That's the code that you need to write. How do I return a name? How do I return an age of a user? It's very simple, and for each box like that, we get automatically we get like an interface of what's going in. Then that box will do some work, maybe call the backend, and then get back like a specific result. All those boxes are basically, we build like a set of very define boxes that are very specific and very easy to write. I get a user, how do I get the user's name? That's it. I get a user, how do I get the user's age? Maybe I need to call the server, maybe not. But then, and that's something that you do today anyway, you write those functions. But then, what GraphQL does, what the magical GraphQL function does basically is it gets a query, and then what it does, it says, okay, so the root level is get user, so bring me the box of get user. I will run that for you. When I'll get the results of that user, I'll get a user object, then I would actually grab the functions that you wrote before, and I will send those functions, the users that just ended up from the root query, and I will run them and execute them. One, the name is just, it's just a text, it's ready, so I can put it in my pattern, in my result. The other one is messages. This thing will return to me just a list of messages. So now, the GraphQL engine itself would get those 3 messages, and for each message, it will run the boxes that we wrote in parallel, and will put the results in the right place. Everything you see here is automated. You don't need to write it. So when we talk about this function and where to use it, the question is, where do you do this work today? And the answer is, if we look at like a mobile app, and that mobile app, let's say, sends like REST requests over the network today, you do it on your client. You use probably Redux or NGRX, and you basically write those boxes, but then you actually write manual code that does that work. So you have a nice store that calls the server, and each component queries from that global store whatever we need, and we have this amazing architecture of using NGRX or the other state management solutions, and we order our code very nicely, but we still write code to call whatever the component needs. We write specific code, we write it manually. So everyone is talking about how to reduce the boilerplate or how to do those things, like write maybe less or automate some of those things. Maybe we can automate the whole thing because we know what the data we get and we know what the shape of the data that we want. Why won't we automate it? Why should we write it automatically? So this thing helps us, it gives us order, but it doesn't give us automations. And we're programmers. When we see something that could be automated, we probably should use it. And in my opinion, that's the biggest problem today because this is a quote from a blog post from PayPal. Like what they say is basically, we found that UI developers are spending less than a third of their time actually building UI. The rest of the time was figuring where and how to fetch data, filtering and mapping over that data, and orchestrating all those different API calls, like making sure everything comes, build it in the right shape, and send it back to the component. After that, doing all of that, UI is actually a nice-to-have thing to do. And the thing is, if I'm looking at Angular conferences, look at the amount of talks that are being spent on state management solutions. So that's probably a similar reflection of your time, what you do in your work, and you are UI developers. But everything I said about this magical GraphQL solution that will automate that work for you, it's not a huge invention. Like we can actually talk about databases did the same thing. The whole function of a database is that we have a schema, and we normalize the data. It's organized the data in a particular way, and then each client can query what they want and get a predictable result, and it won't affect anyone else. We don't have this. Databases took this weird concept of having one big global state that is not organized, and we have no idea what's going on there, and we just normalized it, and we ordered it, and now each client can just query what they need. And the funny thing is that we do it anyway. We write in Angular for sure. We write in NGRX, we type all the data anyway. But TypeScript just is good for validation on the build time. We don't do anything with it on runtime. If we would use it in runtime, then we could get the power of SQL over our data, whether it's remote or local. But SQL is hard, so GraphQL is like SQL for dummies. Or for... And all I'm saying now is just didn't convince you that you should look at that and you're very happy with the manual code that you write today to organize your data, ask yourself another question. Why does Facebook doesn't use Redux? Like we are, right? We're like, what is NGRX? It's basically a byproduct of a concept that came from the React community from Redux. But Facebook never used Redux. So why is that? So let's maybe do a little of an investigation. So let's look at this library. Wait. Can you see it? This library is called Normalizer. And as you can see, it's a pretty popular library in the React community. And that library, the idea, what does it do? It basically normalizes nested JSON according to a schema. Okay, and apparently a lot of Redux users are using it. What's the motivation for this library? Many APIs, public or not, return JSON data that has deeply nested objects. So basically, we call APIs and we get the data that is not exactly the shape that we want. Why? Because it's generalized backend. They don't care what they want. They want to expose. They want to expose as general API as possible. So using the data of this kind of structure is very often difficult for JavaScript applications, especially when using Flux or Redux, because now we get this like weird blob of information of data, and we need to write those reducers and write those selectors and all that code to organize the data. So this is a library that basically we describe the data in a schema, and then automatically we restructured it. But let's scroll a bit down here and let's look at the credits. So Normalizer was originally created by Dan Abramov and was inspired by a conversation with Ying Chang. That's an important thing, and Ying Chang is like the key figure here. Basically, what happened in Facebook is that they started with GraphQL, then they came with the Flux architecture, and then React. What they did, the way they open sourced those three tools was the other way around. They open sourced React, then they talked about the Flux architecture, and until GraphQL came in, Redux came to be. And then Ying Chang, which is an amazing, if you Google her talks, is like the most important, I think, front-end architecture talks ever. Once, in my opinion, once the teams inside Facebook saw how Redux became so popular, they said, okay, until we open source GraphQL, maybe we should bring some of the concepts and explain people how we actually use Redux. And how we actually use the Flux architecture. And what's happening actually in Facebook is that having this big blob of data is just not scalable. You can't handle it. You have to have a schema and a query if you want to handle a really large global state. So, basically, Facebook's Redux is called Relay. It's kind of like Redux with Normalizer, which means we describe a schema of the data, and then each component queries just for the data that they need. And they get back the exact result. So that's how you actually can manage like tens of thousands of components at scale. If you have tens of thousands of components and you have this one huge global unorganized blob of information, that's not scalable. And that's what most of us are doing today. And that's why we write a lot of manual code. Yes. So I hope that at least I got you to think about other possible solutions that what you're doing today, and maybe think about some use cases of where you write a lot of code today. Maybe you use amazing tools like RxJS to like manipulate the data easierly, but maybe you don't need to do that. Maybe you just automate it. You just tell the machine and the function, this is the data that I have, this is how I want it to be. So if we look at how this is actually fits into our architecture today, let's look at an app. And again, we talked about a regular app that has components and is calling the server. So that app is made from a lot of different components. And let's just describe them. You have the header, the kinds of different components. But maybe what if each component will describe the data that they need just right next to the component? So then if I need to make a change and I need to query more data, whether it's local or not, I just change it in one file. I don't need to go to a reducer and update the reducer. And maybe there's another component that used the reducer and now I broke it without knowing it. Or maybe I do know it, but now I need to figure out some solutions of how to support the two. In this architecture, all the change is just being done on one component, individualized, and then each component will just have its like GraphQL snippets or this small query next to it, and we'll just use the GraphQL engine on the client, not on the server, to just handle all that stuff and then sends a request to the server. So what if we will just take that GraphQL function and instead of now arguing with architects and trying to convince all kinds of people why GraphQL is amazing, why don't we just install it like we would install NGRX from NPM on our own library and just save a bunch of code and write a fully automated local state management library and still call the server as it was before. And what we get from it is then we get the main benefits of GraphQL, which is just the development speed. We just can delete, like we saw in the PayPal blog post, we can just delete a bunch of the code that we write today manually and just get to the feature faster. And we get the organization of just writing those functions and letting GraphQL to orchestrate them for us. So again, what's the main takeaway from this way of thinking is that instead of now, arguing, maybe we won't get all the benefits from this, from the network, network performance that we used to get, but we get to delete basically a lot of the local code that we write today, a lot of it, and just automate it. And then we move faster in the organization. Now, once we did that, and we're now like a GraphQL expert, but we have it just in our, inside our Angular apps. We don't have it at all outside of it. Now, if we want to we get to the point that we actually want to use those benefits, all we need to do is just take the same box. It's still JavaScript. We can just put it on the server with a really, really small modifications, like really small modifications, and put it in a server farm, or put it in some cloud functions, and get all the benefits of those. But the main idea here again is that now you just wrote basically local, you basically took the same code you use today, which is the local state management and syncing with your backend development, syncing with the backend data and everything. You made it much easierly. You're still front-end developers, right? But then you took the same code, you made it better, you used tools, and then you just put the same code on the server. Now you're backend developers. That's all. And so you're still the same person, but now you suddenly became backend developer. So in my opinion, GraphQL often is being described as something just too hard, which is not. And it's described as something in between the server and the like the server and the front end, and maybe it's backend people who need to control the schema. It's not. Even if you look at how it's used in Facebook, it's the same teams. I won't dive too much deep into that, but it's the same product teams that designed the GraphQL schema. It's the same product team that designed the front-end screens. So you basically write the same code. It's easier, but it happens to be that now you can suddenly take the same code and put it on the server. But you are still in my opinion, you are still the people, I mean the product developers, like the front-end developers, you are the ones who needs to be responsible for the schema and the creation of this code. So basically, the main points that I wanted to say today, which I think is a bit different from how GraphQL is usually being presented, is that GraphQL is just a function. And you can use it today for one component. It's go like install GraphQL.js. You don't need any fancy tools. You can just install GraphQL.js, call the GraphQL function, describe the data that just that component needs, and just do the whole work for one component and already get the benefits on your existing app. That's all. And it solves more than just performance. It will just organize the code in a way that I think today you work very hard to achieve. So I made this talk very conceptually and very short because I wanted to get people to ask questions. Because even though it all sounds amazing, somehow people are still not doing that. So two things about that. First of all, I will answer questions. And the second thing, there's sources, like we created this website, it's completely free, you can go there, there's courses, step by step of how to build a full WhatsApp clone. And you can just like go step by step and go through that. It's a good tutorial, I wrote it. And I want you to talk to us, like I said, a lot of us came from enterprise companies, and we know you're right, it's very hard to introduce new tools. So if you're like in a big company, and we know how hard it is to introduce new tools, we have different perspectives on it. So we can help you get this thing passed. And the third thing that I want to say is that you get free PRs. So if there's a reason, if you feel like this might be good, but you don't have time for it right now, you don't know how it will actually solve something in your own current app, just talk to me and I'll come and give you free PRs. I will PR your own code for free and show you, and you don't need to merge this PR. You can just see on your own code how your code looks before and after. I did it a few talks before, and every person that I gave free PRs to, they moved to GraphQL later. So use me, really. Like, it's a real call. So how much time is left? 2 minutes, okay. So let's do questions. Yeah. Yes.
What if your backend is not JavaScript?
So, great question. So, first of all, you can still just use it on the front end, right? So that's the first thing that I think people fail to see, that even if you just use it on the front end, you get a lot of the benefits. As a product team, you move much faster. Anyway, GraphQL, the concepts are very similar between all the languages and all the different engines. So first of all, if you can convince your backend developers to use GraphQL, that's great. If you can't, you can take on this work and maybe learn Java. If not, I would say, it depends on the case, but I would say what we do usually is we start on the front end, and then when this, if there's like people are against putting now on the back end a new technology like Node, we say, okay, you have two options, and we just wait, because if nobody cares about the network latency, then it's fine. Your day-to-day is amazing. You get to write really cool code. You get to move faster, and yeah, there's more requests over the network, but nobody cares.
Do you have a Java implementation?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, there's GraphQL implementations on the backend for any language, basically. .NET, Java, Perl, C++, Ruby, everything. But the thing is, again, if you have the option of, in my opinion, if you have the option to, and this is not a common opinion, but if you have the option to have the same language and the same people write also the GraphQL part of it, I think it's better.
We unfortunately don't have any more time for questions, but you do know that you get to ask Uri all the questions you want upstairs in the session that's starting in half an hour. Also starting in half an hour is Dan Wallin's talk down here, and I'm going to ask you all to leave the room again because they're going to take the wall down. But before we do that, please give a big round of applause for this wonderful talk.